Hello and welcome. My name is Alan, and we're going to talk a bit today about an issue. It's very relative to what's going on right now, but I've often asked this a number of times. 2016, Trump had Make America Great Again. Great again for who? You do realize the 1950s and 1960s was not a golden era for everybody. There was still a lot of wrongs, a lot of issues. Sure, for some people, oh, it was amazing. But for a lot of people, no, it sucked. People, you have to remember, women were still fighting for rights. People of color were still fighting for rights. You know, so make America great again. Great for who? And one of the things we need to look at when I point this out is the government of the U.S. Sorry, I was eating rice and I can still feel a grain or something still in my throat. But anyway, the U.S. government is complicit in so much of the wrongs and evils in the world. I want to point this out. The Nuremberg Principles, this is from Wikipedia, set of guidelines for determining what constitutes a war crime. The document itself was created by the ILC, International Law Commission of the United Nations, which were fairly newly created to codify the legal principles underlying the Nuremberg trials of Nazi Party members following World War II. Because you don't want people being charged for this or that and saying what you've done is wrong. No, you want a set of laws. And so these principles were born from the Nuremberg trials, which, like I said, it said members of the Nazi Party would be tried for following World War II. I think the highest ranking that was actually tried during the Nuremberg trials was it Hermann Goering? Let me take a look. I think it's Goering that was the highest ranked um, Nazi that was tried during the Nuremberg trials. Others higher than him were already um, had either died or escaped or some of the most prominent Nazis: Hitler, Heinrich Himmler, Joseph Goebbels, um, were or had committed suicide and therefore could not be tried. Prosecutors wanted to try representative leaders of German politics, economy, and military But we're getting off topic anyway. Yeah. So that gave birth to the Nuremberg Principles, which was our first set of international laws, international ethics. And the principle said, under Principle 1, any person who commits an act which constitutes a crime under international law is responsible therefore and liable to punishment. Principle 2 states the fact that internal law does not impose a penalty for an act which constitutes a crime under international law does not relieve the person who committed the act from responsibility under international law. So, yeah. So, international law, if international law states doing these things are a crime, that person should be able to be held accountable. And Principle 2 is saying just because a law in the country does not impose such actions, it determines on if it's criminal under international law. Principle 3, so the fact that a person who committed an act which constitutes a crime under international law acted as head of state or responsible government official does not relieve him from responsibility under international law. Just because you're a leader, a president, a prime minister, whatever, what have you, that doesn't matter, because if you have committed such an act that is against international law, you still need to be held responsible. Principle 4, the fact that a person acted pursuant to order of his government or of a superior does not relieve him from responsibility. So, also, if you commit such things, even though you're just, a low man on the totem pole, if you commit the act, you're still guilty. There should be a level of morality in you. Principle 5, any person charged with a crime under international law has the right to a fair trial on the facts and law. So, yeah. I think that's common law. Basically, you have the right to have a trial, a fair trial, where you've got representation, your evidence can be admitted, and so on. Principle 6. The crimes hereinafter are set out as punishable as crimes under international law. The first one, crimes against peace, which are planning, preparation, initiation, or waging of a war of aggression or a war of violation of international treaties, agreements, or assurances. So, yeah. There's a number of incidences like this where we have, the three-letter organizations, CIA, NSA, FBI, all these kinds of things, they've gotten kind of involved in trying to overturn leaders and stuff. and participation in a common plan or conspiracy for the accomplishment of any of the acts mentioned under. So, yeah. War crimes. Violations of the laws or customs of war, which include but are not limited to murder, ill treatment, or deportation to slave labor, or for any other purpose of civilian population of or in occupied territory. Murder or ill treatment of prisoners of war or persons on the seas, killing of hostages, plunder of public or private property, wanton destruction of cities, towns, or villages, or devastation not justified by military necessity. So, yeah, um, think um, oh, Guantanamo Bay during the heyday of the Iraq-Afghanistan wars, and think of the way Palestinians are treated in Israeli prisons. Think of the way that civilians are being treated. So, yeah, it's just, it's that kind of stuff. Those are war crimes according to the Nuremberg principles. And crimes against humanity: murder, extermination, enslavement, deportation, and other inhumane acts done against any civilian population, or persecutions on political, racial, or religious grounds when such acts are done or such persecutions are carried on in execution of or in connection with any crime against peace or any war crime. Leaders, organizers, instigators, and accomplices participating in the formulation or execution of a common plan or conspiracy to commit any of the foregoing crimes are responsible for all acts performed by any persons in execution of such plan. So you cannot help plan these things, you cannot participate, you cannot say go do this or that. You're still a part of the act. And when dealing with crimes against humanity, and often you think of the population marches, the Rohingya in Myanmar, and there's a number of other populaces that have been attacked simply because of their race or religion or politics. I mean, what started World War II in Germany, the treatment of gypsies and the Jews would be crimes against humanity. And Principle 7, complicity in the commission of a crime against peace, a war crime or a crime that humanity has set forth in Principle 6, is a crime under international law. So it's just reaffirming all that said under Principle 6. Now, the issue is there was no real way to enforce it. or that didn't really have any serious strength. So, yeah. But these are what base a lot of our current international laws were developed from. Now, according to the ICC, the International Criminal Court, crimes within the jurisdiction of the International Criminal Court. War crimes. War crimes include torture, mutilation, corporal punishment, hostage taking, and acts of terrorism. This category also covers violations of human dignity, such as rape and forced prostitution, looting, and execution without trial. War crimes, unlike crimes against humanity, are always committed in times of war. So, thus, the difference between the two. Now, genocide. This includes all acts committed with the intent to destroy a national, ethnic, or religious group. Something that has often been stated is a goal of the nation of Israel that they wish to do to Palestinians. So yes, this is a genocide. And crimes against humanity. Crimes against humanity are acts committed as part of a widespread or systematic attack directed against any civilian population, such as murder, deportation, torture, and rape. The ICC prosecutes the perpetrators even if the crimes were not committed in times of war. So, even if they're not in a conflict with anybody, if you're doing these kinds of things, these will count as crimes against humanity. Again, the forced deportation of Rohingya, where they felt they needed to leave. Hell, you could look at, even though these international laws weren't set, you could look at the treatment of the Native Americans by Andrew Jackson on the forced Trail of Tears march. And yeah, the Rwandan genocide, the Rwandan murders between two groups of people, the Hutus and the Tutsis. Consequences of the crime of aggression. The states that are party to the Rome Statute have not yet reached consensus on the definition of and punishment for aggression. Until they do, the ICC is unable to prosecute individuals for acts of aggression. So that's where we look at a bit of a gray area. The powers of the ICC. The ICC is only competent to hear a case if the country where the offense was committed is part of the Rome Statute, or the perpetrator's country of origin is a party to the Rome Statute. The ICC may only exercise its jurisdiction if the national court is unable or unwilling to do so. The ICC only has jurisdiction over offenses committed after the statute's entry. So, it's not a, what was the word? ad hoc, post hoc, or something like that. It's not retroactive. You can't go back before the date of the statute's agreement and judge crimes before. So, referring a case to the ICC. Various parties have the right to refer a case to the ICC. Any state party of the Rome Statute, irrespective of any violent or involvement in the alleged offense, the prosecutor of the ICC, and the United Nations Security Council. Any of those three may ask the ICC to refer a case. The UN Security Council may ask the ICC to defer investigation of a case for a limited period if it considers that the proceedings would constitute an obstruction to its powers. Situations currently under investigation by the ICC. So yeah, these are currently ones under investigation. Sudan, Uganda, Democratic Republic of Congo, Central African Republic, and Kenya, all African states, nations. So yeah, there was a lot of issues that went on. I know there was a lot of you would often hear about Uganda and Sudan having issues. Murders and genital mutilations and stuff like that. So yeah. But finally, the United Nations, this is from the United Nations Office on Genocide Prevention and the Responsibility to Protect. Definition as per the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court. Article 8, War Crimes. The court shall have jurisdiction in respect of war crimes, in particular when committed as part of a plan or policy or as part of a large-scale commission of such crimes. For the purpose of this statute, war crimes means grave breaches of the Geneva Convention of August 12, 1949, namely any of the following acts against persons or property protected under the provisions of the relevant Geneva Convention: willful killing, torture or inhumane treatment, including biological experiments, willfully causing great suffering or serious injury to body or health, extensive destruction and appropriation of property not justified by military necessity and carried out unlawfully and wantonly, compelling a prisoner of war or other protected person to serve in the forces of a hostile power, willfully depriving a prisoner of war or other protected person of the rights of fair and regular trial, unlawful deportation or transfer, or unlawful confinement, and taking of hostages. Other serious violations of the laws and customs applicable to the international armed conflict within the established framework of international law, namely any of the following acts: intentionally directing attacks against the civilian population as such, or against individual civilians not taking direct part in hostilities. Intentionally directing attacks against civilian objects, that is, objects which are not military objectives. So yeah, we've already seen so many of these Israel under Netanyahu commit. Intentionally directing attacks against personnel, installations, material, units, or vehicles involved in a humanitarian assistance or peacekeeping mission in accordance with the Charter of the UN, as long as they are entitled to the protection given to civilian or civilian objects under the international law of armed conflict. So yeah, medical help, humanitarian aid, you're supposed to leave those things alone. They shouldn't be your targets in a conflict. Intentionally launching an attack in the knowledge that such attack will cause incidental loss of life, injury to civilians, or damage to civilian objects, or widespread, long-term, and severe damage to the natural environment, which would be clearly excessive in relation to the concrete and direct overall military advantage anticipated. Attacking or bombarding by whatever means towns, villages, dwellings, or buildings which are undefended and which are not military objectives, like hospitals, stores, schools, places of worship, stuff like that. Killing or wounding a combatant who, having laid down his arms or having no longer means of defense, has surrendered at discretion. Making improper use of a flag of truce or of the flag of the military insignia and uniform of the enemy or of the United Nations, as well as its distinctive emblems of the Geneva Conventions, resulting in death and serious personal injury. The transfer, directly or indirectly, by the occupying power of parts of its own civilian population into the territory it occupies, or the deportation or transfer of all of the parts if the population of the occupied territory within or outside this territory. Intentionally directing attacks against buildings dedicated to religion, education, art, science, or charitable purposes, historic monuments, hospitals, and places where the sick and wounded are collected, provided they are not military objectives. Subjecting persons who are in power of an adverse party to physical mutilation or to medical or scientific experiments of any kind, which are neither justified by medical, dental, or hospital treatment of the person concerned or carried out in his or her interest, and which cause death or seriously endanger the health of such person or persons. Killing or wounding treacherously individuals belonging to the hostile nation, or army. So you got to realize that's not saying out. We understand there's going to be casualties in war, but it cannot be a malicious intent to kill. You know, as per one of the previous ones, where if they are unarmed and unable to defend themselves, then you do not kill them. I believe you can put them in temporary confinement. But yeah. And you cannot wound treacherously, meaning leaving a person in a situation where their life could never be the same again, that kind of thing. So, declaring that no quarter will be given. In other words, there must be a safe zone. Destroying or seizing the enemy's property unless such destruction or seizure be imperatively demanded by the necessities of war. Declaring abolished, suspended, or inadmissible in a court of law the rights and actions of the nationals of the hostile party. And there's a similar instance of this in the U.S. during the Civil War. The suspension of habeas corpus under Lincoln. So yeah, it's often considered one of the worst things he ever did. Compelling the nationals of the hostile party to take part in the operations of war directed against their own country, even if they were in the belligerent service before the commencement of the war. So yeah, don't conscript soldiers of the other side if you've defeated them, more or less. But yeah, there's a ton of these. You can look through them. I'll be posting this in the description box below the video. But what I wanted to show, there are principles that are followed. Now, with all this said, the U.S., my own country, is guilty of so many of these crimes against humanity, these war crimes. Yeah. But let's watch this. This is a video from a Turkish public broadcast that talks about the war crimes committed by the U.S. since the adoption of the Statue of Liberty. So yeah.
135 years after the iconic Statue of Liberty was sent to New York City, a new Lady Liberty is on its way to the United States of America. But has the US renewed its vows with liberty, democracy, and freedom? And can its internal and foreign policies today be considered a benchmark for the so-called free world?
The Philippine-American War. We obtained the Philippines after the Spanish-American War, and the Philippines wanting its own right of self-determination because for so long they were controlled by Spain and then America. Yeah.
Soon after the Statue of Liberty was sent in 1886, Spain ceded the Philippines to the US. Seeking colonialism, the US was faced with a Filipino independence struggle. According to the US State Department, the US killed more than 20,000 Filipino combatants, and more than 200,000 Filipino civilians were killed in US concentration camps as a result of violence, famine, and disease.
So yeah, 20,000 combatants, Filipino combatants killed. I mean, you look at the death toll as it sits in Gaza right now. We're at the 40,000 mark. We've already doubled this. Seen it double this, I should say. And then, of course, imprisonment in concentration camps. 200,000 Filipino civilians. Here's combatants. Here's civilians. Yeah. War collaboration with the Nazis. Yeah. There were many fledgling Nazi groups in the U.S. in the 1930s into the 40s. They existed. They were there. So, if you thought America was always... No, there's always been bad seeds in America.
Despite the US playing a vital role in defeating Nazi Germany, declassified documents have revealed many of the US's scandalous dealings with the Third Reich. This includes direct collaboration from the American company IBM and its founder, Thomas Watson, that stretched into the war years. According to a Guardian investigation, George Bush's grandfather, US Senator Prescott Bush, was also a director and shareholder of companies that profited from their involvement with Nazi Germany.
Now remember, the US, while we didn't immediately enter World War II, we profited off selling supplies to both sides, although we eventually just started supplying to the Allies instead of the Axis powers. So,
and finally, US government officials in collaboration with the CIA actively recruited and worked with known Nazi war criminals such as fascist ideologue Emil Augsburg, who was employed in the US's crusade against Soviet Russia during the Cold War.
Yeah. We worked with a number of former Nazis during the Cold War in what is well known now as Operation Paperclip. Basically, we plucked some of the most brilliant minds and stuff out of Nazi Germany, and so they were given a new life, some here in the US while others went to the Soviet Union. And yeah, they would help as part of the space race and other things. So yeah. But anyway,
despite the overwhelming victory of the Allied powers in the Second World War, the US detonated 2 nuclear weapons on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in Japan, killing more than 200,000 civilians. This remains the only use of nuclear weapons in the history of armed conflict.
Yeah. 2 southern towns in Japan. Now, what we do know is, I think it was the Potsdam agreements or something like that. the U.S. demanded unconditional surrender. Japan was willing to surrender, but there were certain things they wanted to be able to keep in place. And the U.S. was like, no. So we went ahead and dropped the bomb on Hiroshima. And 3 days later, we dropped a second one on Nagasaki. So yeah, at that point, Japan gave in. Now, there is an argument that perhaps there was a way to better negotiate without all the lives killed. Though many generals and stuff will say it put a quicker end, so less life was lost. But that it's still debatable.
At the start of the 20th century, the US shaped or installed governments in many countries around the world, including neighbors Panama, Honduras, Nicaragua, Mexico, Haiti, and the Dominican Republic. During the Cold War era, the US reached its peak of foreign tampering and interventions, including the 1953 CIA-backed coup in Iran against socialist leader Mohammad Mossadegh to reinstall the autocratic Shah of Iran, and the 1961 Bay of Pigs invasion against Cuba's Castro, in addition to 638 attempts to assassinate the revolutionary leader. According to a report published in the New York Times, the US led at least 81 overt and covert known interventions in foreign elections during the period 1946 to 2000.
Remember, they're so afraid of the spread of communism that they commit all these acts. They back all these coups. This foreign intervention into Latin America and the Caribbean, as they mentioned also the coup in Iran. Yeah. It's one of the darker sides of the U.S. and their actions is they're so willing to stick their nose in even if the leader is a properly, freely elected leader of the nation that's liked and loved by the people. If they aren't up to what the U.S. wants them to be, the U.S. will often do something to try to interfere.
The US's fight against communism meant that the US committed its armed forces extensively in several proxy wars, such as those fought in Vietnam and Korea. The US involvement in Vietnam cost the lives of some 365,000 civilians. This includes massacres committed by US troops against unarmed civilians, such as the My Lai massacre. Vietnam has stated that 2 million civilians on both sides and some 1.1 million North Vietnamese and Viet Cong fighters were killed. The US extensively used chemical warfare during this period.
Yeah, Agent Orange, and they did a number of other tactics. Knowing the, I know one of them they talk about a lot is they tried to play with the heads of the Vietnamese through the knowledge that the Vietnamese believed a lot in ghosts, so they made it seem like ghosts were speaking or screaming that it needs to end. I died. You can go home. You can leave. It's horrible. You know, try to make other Vietnamese abandon. Yeah.
A US program, codenamed Operation Ranch Hand, sprayed 20 million gallons of various herbicides over Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos from 1961 to 1971.
War on terror.
After the 9/11 terrorist attacks in New York City, the US launched another crusade, this time against Iraq and Afghanistan. It lied and claimed that Iraq had weapons of mass destruction.
Yeah, that
it didn't. The US invaded anyway, resulting in the death of more than 1 million Iraqis in the ensuing invasion, insurgencies, and civil wars. The US practice of torture, rape, and other war crimes in Abu Ghraib prison were also exposed. The US's protracted chaos in the Middle East gave rise to groups such as Daesh, their reign of terror across the Arabian Peninsula and beyond. This is not to mention the US's own active torture and detention base in Guantanamo Bay, Cuba, and its global rendition program. The US war in Afghanistan in 2001 resulted in the death of more than 240,000 people in Pakistan and Afghanistan, including more than 70,000.
Now, like I said, I was skeptical as hell about Iraq. I'm like, why? Why the fuck are we going into Iraq? Afghanistan, I had a little more willingness to say, okay, I understand. It's where a lot of his operations were supposedly in, although we found out he wasn't there, and then it was like 2012 we managed to kill him in Pakistan. So I was like, why did we stay in Afghanistan for so fucking long? And then we continued to stay another decade. So yeah, it was bullshit.
Civilians. But is this all really a surprise in a country that was built upon slavery and the genocide of its own native indigenous population? As a UN Secretary General once said, there is no difference between diplomacy and deception. And so, if the Statue of Liberty is supposed to represent the US's outlook to the world, it is arguably a deception not only to the world, but more importantly, to its own people.
So yeah. Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to be free. This is part of the inscription on the Statue of Liberty. Although many people can look at that and say, no, that's not how the U.S. is acting. And again, start of this video, make America great again. Great for who? Who are we making it great for? Because there's always been issues. A better choice would be, let's make America great. But no. He puts out the bullshit, make America great again. Okay, so what were we so great at before? What is your definition? You know. Anyway, last bit here we're going to watch.
Noam Chomsky. If the Nuremberg principles were applied, every post-World War II president would be indictable.
Move this back here. Noam Chomsky, one of the great thinkers. He's in an interview. Let's go ahead and listen to the first bit of this because it's so huge with what it has.
You said that if the Nuremberg principles were applied, every post-World War II president would be indictable.
That's probably true.
Can we run down them real fast? What did Eisenhower do that you would indict him for?
Eisenhower overthrew the conservative nationalist government of Iran with a military coup. He overthrew the first and last democratic government in Guatemala by military coup and invasion.
So yeah, already starting Eisenhower, second president under whom the CIA and the NSA existed, and he's already using them to overthrow governments. Already a war crime.
Invasion leading to years of, in Iran it led to 25 years of brutal dictatorship, finally overthrown in '79. In Guatemala it led to massive atrocities which are still continuing. That's after almost 50 years. In Indonesia, this wasn't known until recently, but he conducted the major clandestine terror operation of the post-war period up until Cuba and Nicaragua in an effort to break up Indonesia, strip off the outer islands where most of the resources are, and undermine what was then considered as a threat of Indonesian democracy. Indonesia was too free and open. It was allowing a political party of the poor.
So again, Indonesia, it was a democracy. But because it wasn't doing what the U.S. thought it should do, it overthrew a democracy. Yeah. It's just so ridiculous.
To participate, they were gaining a lot of ground, so that Eisenhower supported and helped instigate a military rebellion in the outer islands. This is just for starters. These are all indictable offenses.
What about Kennedy?
Kennedy was one of the worst. Kennedy, first of all, invaded South Vietnam. During the Eisenhower administration, they had blocked a political settlement in 1954 and instituted a kind of a Latin American style terror state, which had killed maybe 6.
So again, Kennedy, JFK, he's involved as well. All these coups, these overthrows. He attempted an overthrow in Cuba, which is now a famous blunder known as the Bay of Pigs invasion. Yeah. It's just ridiculous.
60 or 70,000 people by the end of the Eisenhower period, and had instigated a response, a reaction. Kennedy recognized that it couldn't be controlled internally, so he simply invaded. In 1962, about a third of the bombing missions were carried out by the U.S. Air Force in U.S. planes with South Vietnamese insignia, but U.S. pilot. He authorized napalm. He began the use of chemical weapons to destroy food crops. They began programs which...
So yeah, at this point, he's heading the Vietnam War. And he's using all these tactics on the population. I mentioned earlier about the one to make them think they were hearing ghosts. And we've also heard about the use of pest or herbicides, which kills off a lot of the plants, and I'm sure wasn't too good to ingest either. Agent Orange was a well-known used chemical during this war.
Drove millions of people into what amounted to concentration camps. Now, that's aggression. In the case of Cuba, It was just a massive campaign of international terrorism, which almost led to the destruction of the world, led to the missile crisis. And we can continue. Again, these are all indictable offenses.
About Johnson?
Well, Johnson expanded the war in Indochina to the point where it ended up probably leaving 3 or 4 million people dead.
Yeah. Johnson, LBJ, Lyndon B. Johnson, expands the war in Vietnam. And not only did he have these foreign issues, he also liked to wiretap certain individuals. It's a bit well known that Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was wiretapped. That LBJ and his 3-letter organizations often had information on Dr. King they would try to use against him.
He invaded the Dominican Republic to block what looked like a potential democratic revolution there, supported the Israeli occupation in its early stages. Again, we can go around the world. Take, say, Carter. You know,
I'll get there, but Nixon's next.
Nixon, we don't even have to talk about. We can skip that one, okay?
Right.
But
yeah, Nixon had so many crimes. It was just ridiculous. Another president who liked wiretaps. Yeah. And then, of course, he continued the Vietnam War, but wound it down at least, ending it. But yeah.
Ford.
Well, Ford was only there for a short time, but long enough to endorse the Indonesian invasion of East Timor, which became about as close to genocide as anything in the modern period.
So yeah, Gerald Ford, the only president never to be formally elected, because he took office as vice president when Nixon resigns, doesn't seek to have his own election, so he's there only for a few years. But backs an invasion. Say, yeah, go in. And what happens if we have another genocide on our hands?
They pretended to oppose it, but secretly supported, in fact, not so secretly. The U.S., immediately after the invasion, the U.S. did join the rest of the world in formally condemning it at the Security Council. But Ambassador Moynihan was kind enough to explain to us, in his words, that his instructions were to render the United Nations utterly ineffective in any actions it might take to counter the Indonesian invasion. And he says proudly that he did this with considerable success. His next sentence says, in the next few months, it seems that about 60,000 people were killed. And then he goes off to the next topic. That's the first few months, went on to probably hundreds of thousands. Formally, the U.S. Announced a boycott of weapons, but secretly it increased the supply of weapons, including counterinsurgency equipment, so that the Indonesians could consummate the invasion. That's just a short period in office, but that's indictable.
Yeah, so all these backroom planning and smoke-filled meetings and yeah.
seriously, in fact. That's a major war crime.
Carter?
Carter increased, as the Indonesian atrocities were increasing. They peaked in 1978. Carter's flow of weapons to Indonesia increased when Congress imposed human rights restrictions. By then there was a human rights movement in Congress to block the flow of advanced weaponry to Indonesia. Carter arranged through...
Again, not there long. He was a one-term president, but he also was responsible for continuing these acts. And as I've often said about Carter, great human being, probably one of the most Christian-like Christians out there, that they're supposed to follow. Not all Christians follow the example they're supposed to follow, but anyway, great human being. But he was horrible as a leader.
Mondale, vice president, to get Israel to send U.S. Skyhawks to Indonesia to enable Indonesia to complete what turned out to be near genocide, killing maybe a quarter of the population or something. In the Middle East, Carter just won the Nobel Prize. His great achievement was the Camp David agreements. The Camp David agreements are presented as a diplomatic triumph for the United States. In fact, they were a diplomatic catastrophe. At Camp David, the United States and Israel accepted, finally, Egypt's 1971 offer, which they had then, U.S. had rejected at the time, except that now it was worse from the U.S.-Israeli point of view because it included the Palestinians. In order to get Israel to accept Egypt's 1971 offer, after a major war and atrocities and so on, Carter raised aid, military and other aid to Israel, to more than 50% of total aid worldwide. Israel used it at once in exactly the way they said they were going to do, as every sane person knew, as an opportunity to attack their northern neighbor, first in 1978, then in 1982, and to increase integration of the occupied territories.
Yeah, see, we are providing the aid, the weapons to Israel, and even here in the 70s, they're committing so many heinous acts.
And that's for starters. We can continue.
Reagan?
I don't think we have to talk about that one either.
Again, Reagan's one of these corrupt, let me say it again for you, corrupt leaders. You know, some Republicans will sit there and gargle on his sack, but the fact is, Reagan was not a good leader. He did so many things that were just horrible. You know, let's see. The trading was it missiles to, Iran, because it was the Iran-Contra affair, so he could get weapons sent down into Honduras, Nicaragua. Yeah, the Iran-Contra affair, all over North. He was far from clean as a president.
I mean, Reagan is the first president to have been condemned by the International Court of Justice for what they called the unlawful use of force, meaning international terrorism, in the war against Nicaragua. Again, that's just for starters. They also, the Security Council endorsed it in 2 resolutions, both of which were vetoed by the United States.
Bush won.
Well, we can begin with the invasion of Panama. The invasion of Panama, which...
Again, we're doing all these invasions or financially backed invasions, supply-backed invasions of all these other countries. And like I said, it's all these Central, Latin American, South American nations. People wonder why they're fleeing up north. It's because we've constantly stuck our fingers into these other countries and made conditions there worse. And so people are trying to run for a better life. So, in all honesty, it's our fault for immigration the way it is. But some people are like, if they were, they should stay in their own country. Motherfucker! It's our fault in the first place. It's going to be a 95% chance that they are running because of something we did years ago, decades ago. But no, people don't want to look at the fact that these are the fucking consequences.
According to the Panamanians, killed about 3,000 people, since it's never investigated. We don't know if that's true or not. This was done in order to kidnap a disobedient thug who had been supported by the United States right through his worst atrocities. Noriega. He was brought to Florida and tried for crimes that he committed mostly on the CIA payroll. Okay, that's aggression. We could go into the details of the war.
Yeah, so we used Noriega to enact certain things, and then we turn around, take them to Florida, and put them on trial. Trying to say, we're just enforcing proper law. No, we're trying to cover up our tracks.
We're in Iraq, but there were plainly opportunities for, they might not have worked, we don't know, but there were opportunities for diplomatic settlement, which the Bush administration refused to consider. And incidentally, the press would not report, with a single exception. And Long Island Newsday, which did report the whole story throughout accurately, and is the only newspaper in the country to have done so. The Bush administration then did attack, and the attack was carried out in a manner which is criminal under the laws of war. They attacked infrastructure. I mean, if you attack New York City and you destroy the electrical system, the power system, the sewage systems, and so on, that amounts to biological warfare, and that's the nature of the attack. Then came a sanctions regime, which it's mostly Clinton, but began with Bush, which is, by conservative estimates, killed hundreds of thousands of people while strengthening Saddam Hussein. That takes us off to Clinton, which that's the beginning, but that's by no means the end. We can run through it. Well, we can run through that.
Clinton has got a big number of skeletons in his closet when it comes to war crimes and crimes against humanity. I can't remember the country it was, but I know he did. He ended up using missile attacks. It was like for a day or two, and then he's like, almost like it was forgot about. I can't remember the country it was, but I remember it happening.
That one case suffices.
All right.
But there are plenty of others.
Bush too?
Let's go on with Clinton.
Okay.
And one of Clinton's minor escapades, very minor, was sending a couple of cruise missiles to the Sudan.
Okay.
Destroy what they knew to be a pharmaceutical plant. There was no intelligence failure. According to the only estimates we have from the German ambassador and the regional director of Near East Foundation, who does field work in Sudan, Both of them estimate several tens of thousands of deaths from one cruise missile attack. It's pretty serious. If somebody did that to us, we'd regard it as bad news. And again, we can continue. In the Middle East, for example, Clinton began by declaring past UN resolutions, in the words of his administration, obsolete and anachronistic. Okay, so we're finished with that. No more international law. Then comes a period.
Basically an attempt by the U.S. to do what it likes to do best. Shirk responsibility.
All the peace process, except that during the peace process, Israeli settlement, which means settlement paid for by the U.S. taxpayer and supported by U.S. military aid and diplomacy, continually increased. The most extreme year was Clinton's last year, the highest level of settlement, the highest since 1992. Meanwhile, the territories were cantonized, broken up into small regions with infrastructure projects and new settlement. I don't know what you call that, but it's under military occupation. And if anyone else was doing it, we'd call it a war crime. And again, we can continue. Bush 2, I don't think we have to discuss.
Again, Bush 2. Iraq and Afghanistan wars. So yeah. if we, Guantanamo Bay, Gitmo, all that bullshit. That was Bush 2. But yeah. So, and then of course, Obama, he's guilty of war crimes too, continuing the unjust and unnecessary wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. Yeah. Things he should not have done. Continued for a while the Guantanamo Bay Gitmo usage. Yeah. Was a heavy use of using drone strikes. Then we get into Trump, and he's got his own war crimes. An unnecessary strike just to kill Qasem Soleimani of Iran. He was not threatening the U.S. He was fighting Al-Qaeda. But nah, he's a potential terrorist. Yeah. And under him, the the Afghanistan war continued. That's why I almost laugh so hard when people try to say, he's a dub. No, he's not. And it was also his fault that Hamas attacked in the first place by moving the capital of Israel from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. And then Biden, well, we're seeing it now with the whole Gaza genocide. So, yeah, that's Eisenhower up through now. Every one of the U.S. presidents would be guilty of war crimes. Every last one for the last, we could go 100 years. because Truman was guilty of another number of war crimes as well. But yeah, we'll go ahead and end this here because I've already went well over an hour. But with that said, yeah, as always, educate thyself, think, read, study, learn. Someone tells you something you have trouble believing, ask them to cite their sources. I'll be putting links and sources in the description box below the video. Thank you all for watching. I'll see you all in the next one. Until then, later.